In the time before radio voices filled the parlor and before television screens glowed in the corner of the sitting room, people passed their evenings in ways that were quiet and slow and measured by the gentle ticking of the mantel clock. The day would begin to soften as the sun moved lower in the sky, and there was a particular quality to the light that came through the windows in those late afternoon hours. A golden sort of dimness that made everything look softer and warmer and more peaceful than it had appeared at midday, when the work of the day was finishing, when the shops were closing their doors and the farmers were coming in from the fields. People would make their way home along dusty roads or cobblestone streets, walking at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, just steady and regular, like breathing. The women who had been working in town would adjust their shawls against the cooling air, and the men would tip their hats to neighbors they passed, and children would trail along beside their parents, sometimes stopping to look at a stone or a leaf or a piece of string they found interesting, and then catching up again with small running steps that made soft sounds on the ground. Inside the houses, as the evening began to settle in properly, there were preparations to be made that followed the same pattern night after night, season after season, year after year. The lamps needed to be filled with oil, and this was done carefully and slowly, with attention paid to not spilling even a single drop, because oil was precious and waste was something to be avoided. The wicks would be trimmed with small scissors, made especially for this purpose. The blackened ends snipped away so that the flame would burn clean and steady and bright enough to see by, but not so bright as to strain the eyes or use up the oil too quickly. The kitchen would still hold warmth from the cooking that had been done for supper, and often the family would gather there first. In that warm space that smelled of bread and whatever simple meal had been prepared, they would sit around the wooden table, which had been scrubbed clean until the grain of the wood showed through in all its varied patterns, and they would eat together without rushing, passing dishes from hand to hand, pouring water or milk from heavy pitchers, breaking bread into pieces that they would butter slowly, spreading the butter all the way to the edges in the way that felt most satisfying. After the meal was finished, there were dishes to be washed, and this task was done with the same steady attention that was given to everything else. The water would be heated in kettles on the stove, poured into wide basins, and then the dishes would be lowered into the water, one by one, washed with soap that had perhaps been made at home from lye and rendered fat, rinsed in clear water and set to dry on clean cloths spread out on the counter. The person washing would stand at the basin, hands moving in and out of the warm water in a rhythm that was soothing and repetitive, while another person might dry each dish as it was cleaned, using another cloth, rubbing in slow circles until every drop of water was gone and the dish could be put away in the cupboard. When the kitchen was set right again, when everything was clean and in its proper place, the family would move to the sitting room or the parlor, whichever room their particular house contained. This room was usually kept a bit special, not used during the busy day, saved for the evening hours when there was time to sit and be still. There might be a fireplace, and in the cooler months someone would have laid a fire earlier, carefully arranging the kindling and the larger pieces of wood in the way that would make the fire catch easily and burn long and steady. And now that fire would be burning quietly, sending out waves of comfortable warmth and making small crackling sounds that were pleasant to hear. The furniture in these rooms was arranged in ways that had been decided long ago and rarely changed. There might be a sofa with cushions that had been sewn and stuffed by hand. Chairs with wooden arms worn smooth from years of use. A small table here or there, holding a lamp or a book or a basket. The windows would have curtains that someone had hemmed with careful stitches, and these curtains would be drawn against the darkness outside, creating a feeling of shelter and safety and containment that made the room feel even more peaceful. The lighting in these evening rooms was soft and limited, not at all like the bright electric lights that would come later. The oil lamps gave off a warm glow that reached only so far, creating circles of light that faded gently into shadow at the edges of the room. People learned to arrange themselves within these circles of light, pulling their chairs closer to the lamp if they needed to see something clearly, sitting back a bit if they were just resting and didn't need as much light. The shadows moved and shifted slightly as the flame moved in the lamp, and this gentle movement was something people grew so accustomed to that they barely noticed it, though it added to the quiet sense of life and presence in the room. In these evening hours, the members of the household would settle into activities that were quiet and often repetitive, tasks that could be done with the hands while the mind wandered, or while conversation moved slowly from one small topic to another. The women might take up their sewing or their knitting or their mending, work that always needed doing and never seemed to be entirely finished. They would thread needles with thread or yarn, sometimes licking the end of the thread to make it stiff enough to pass through the eye of the needle, trying once or twice or 3 times until it slipped through and could be pulled halfway so that the thread was doubled. The sewing itself was done 1 stitch at a time, the needle going down through the fabric and coming back up, pulling the thread through in a smooth motion, then going down again in just the right spot to make the stitches even and neat. If someone was hemming a skirt or a pair of trousers, the work was repetitive and steady. Inch by inch around the bottom edge, the fabric folded up just so and held in place with pins that would be removed as the sewing reached them. If someone was mending a torn seam or replacing a button, the work was smaller and more detailed, but just as methodical, just as calm, with the same sense of quiet purpose. Knitting made its own soft rhythms, the needles clicking together lightly as the yarn looped around them, and the knitted fabric slowly grew longer. A scarf would emerge from this process over many evenings, or a pair of socks, or a shawl, each stitch exactly like the one before, row after row, building up until the item was long enough or wide enough and could be finished off and put to use. The knitter might count stitches under their breath, or might simply work from memory and feel, knowing by the weight of the needles and the stretch of the yarn when everything was going right. The men of the household also found quiet tasks for their hands during these evening hours. Some would whittle small pieces of wood, using pocket knives that they kept sharp with whetstones, carving away thin curls of wood that fell into their laps or onto newspapers spread on the floor for that purpose. They might be making something useful, like a wooden spoon or a handle for a tool, or they might be making something decorative, like a small figure or a simple toy for a child. The knife would slice through the wood with soft shaving sounds, and the shape of the object would emerge slowly, requiring patience and attention, but not requiring conversation or any kind of hurry. Others might work with leather, if that was their skill, mending a harness or a boot, punching new holes with an all-working oil into the leather to keep it supple, stitching with thick thread and needles strong enough to pierce the tough material. Or they might be looking through newspapers or almanacs, reading slowly in the lamplight, perhaps moving their lips slightly as they read, absorbing news that was already days or weeks old by the time it reached them, but was news nonetheless, information about distant places and events that seemed far removed from the quiet of their own evening rooms. Children, if they were still awake during these hours, would be occupied with quieter versions of their daytime activities. They might play with simple toys on the floor near the fireplace, building small structures with wooden blocks, or arranging little carved animals in patterns and scenes. They might look at picture books, turning the pages carefully, studying the illustrations in the limited light, making up stories in their minds about what was happening in the pictures. Older children might practice their letters or their numbers, copying them onto slates with slate pencils that made scratching sounds, forming each letter with concentration and care, then wiping the slate clean with a damp cloth and starting again. Sometimes there would be reading aloud, one person reading to the others from a book that the family owned or had borrowed from a neighbor or from a lending library in town. The selection of books was often limited, and the same books might be read multiple times over the years, becoming so familiar that people could anticipate what was coming next, but still found comfort and pleasure in hearing the words again. The person reading would sit near the lamp, holding the book at an angle to catch the light, and would read in a steady voice that was loud enough for everyone to hear, but not so loud as to disturb the peaceful atmosphere of the room. The books themselves were treated with respect and care, their pages turned gently, their covers closed softly, their spines unbroken if possible. They might be volumes of poetry or collections of essays or novels that had been popular years before, or instructional books about agriculture or household management or history. The reading would proceed at a measured pace, with pauses at the end of paragraphs or chapters, and sometimes the listener would ask for a passage to be read again if they had particularly enjoyed it, or if their attention had wandered for a moment and they wanted to hear what they had missed. Conversation during these evenings was usually gentle and unhurried, moving from subject to subject without any particular direction or purpose. Someone might mention something that had happened during the day, a person they had seen in town, a comment someone had made, a change they had noticed in the weather or in the garden. Others would respond or not respond, would add their own observations, or would simply nod and continue with whatever they were doing with their hands. Long silences were common and comfortable, not awkward or strange, just natural pauses in which everyone was content to be quiet for a while, listening to the fire or the clock or the small sounds of their own activities. The passage of time in these evenings was marked by subtle changes rather than by dramatic events. The fire would burn lower and would need another log placed on it, which someone would do without being asked, rising from their chair, selecting a piece of wood from the stack near the hearth, and laying it carefully on the coals so that the flames would catch again and build back up. The lamp might begin to dim slightly as the oil level dropped, and someone would notice this and would get up to refill it, going through the same careful process that had been done before supper, trimming the wick again if necessary, adding oil from the can, wiping away any drips with a rag kept nearby for that purpose. As the evening grew later, the activities would begin to wind down naturally, without anyone announcing that it was time to stop. The knitting would be rolled up and put into a basket, the needle marking the place where the work would resume the next evening. The sewing would be folded and the needle stuck safely into a pincushion, the thread snipped with small scissors. The book would be closed with a finger or a scrap of ribbon marking the place, and would be set on the table to wait for tomorrow. The whittling would be set aside, the shavings gathered up and tossed into the fire, where they would catch and burn quickly with tiny, bright flames. There was a routine to preparing for bed that was as established and unchanging as everything else. The lamps in the common rooms would be turned down and eventually extinguished, one after another. As people made their way to their bedrooms, carrying candles in holders or carrying smaller lamps that could be moved from room to room, the light from these portable flames would move through the dark house, creating shifting patterns on the walls and ceilings, illuminating faces from below in ways that made them look softer and younger and more peaceful. In the bedrooms, there were simple preparations to be made. Clothes would be folded and placed on a chair or hung on a peg on the wall. Night clothes would be put on, buttoned, or tied with slow, drowsy movements. Hair would be brushed or braided. Teeth would be cleaned with tooth powder and a brush or with a damp cloth. Faces and hands would be washed in water from a pitcher and basin that sat on a washstand, the water cold now unless someone had thoughtfully brought up warm water from the kitchen. These small acts of care for the body were done with the same methodical attention that had been given to everything else throughout the evening, each step familiar and necessary and mildly soothing. The beds themselves were usually simpler than beds would become in later years, though there was still comfort to be found in them. There might be a mattress stuffed with straw or corn husks or feathers, depending on what was available and what the family could afford. There would be sheets made of linen or cotton, washed and dried and smoothed many times until they were soft. And there would be quilts or blankets that had been made by hand, pieced together from scraps of fabric or woven on a loom, each one representing hours and hours of steady, patient work. In cold weather, there might be several layers of these coverings, creating weight and warmth, and perhaps a heated brick or stone that had been warming by the fire and was now wrapped in flannel and placed near the feet. Getting into bed was a small ritual of adjustment and settling. The covers would be pulled back, the person would climb in carefully, the covers would be pulled up and tucked in around the body, and then there would be a period of shifting and rearranging, finding the most comfortable position, smoothing the pillow, making sure the blankets were distributed evenly. The candle or lamp would be blown out or turned down to almost nothing, and the room would become very dark, darker than rooms would be in later times when streetlights and electric signs would cast some small amount of light through windows, even at night. In this darkness, there would be sounds that were familiar and expected. The house itself would make small settling noises, creaks and sighs as the wood adjusted to the cooling night air. Outside, depending on the season and the location, there might be the sounds of wind in trees, or rain on the roof, or the distant call of a night bird, or simply the profound silence of a rural darkness that city dwellers would rarely experience. These sounds, or the lack of sound, became part of the texture of falling asleep, expected and unremarkable, and somehow reassuring in their familiarity. Before radio brought music and voices and stories into homes at the turn of a dial, and before television brought moving pictures and endless entertainment into living rooms with the press of a button, people's evenings were filled with these slower, quieter activities. The pace of life in those hours after supper was determined by the limitations of lamplight and by the natural rhythms of tiredness that came after a day of physical work. There was no temptation to stay up late watching one more program or listening to one more broadcast, no bright screens to stimulate the mind and push away sleep, no sense that something interesting might be happening somewhere else that was being missed. Instead, there was an acceptance of the darkness and the quiet, a willingness to let the evening be simple and repetitive and calm. The same activities would happen night after night, in the same rooms, with the same people, using the same objects, and following the same patterns. This repetition was not experienced as boring or limiting, but rather as comforting and secure, a reliable structure to the day that required no decisions and no planning and no particular thought. Everyone knew what would happen in the evening because it was what had happened the evening before and what would happen the evening after, an endless gentle cycle that mirrored the larger cycles of the seasons and the years. In some households, particularly on farms or in rural areas, the evenings were even quieter and simpler than in townhouses. The work of the day was often more physically demanding, and people were genuinely tired by the time they came in from the fields or the barn. They might sit for only a short while after supper, perhaps looking into the fire, perhaps talking in low voices about what needed to be done the next day, perhaps simply sitting in companionable silence, too tired for handwork or reading or any activity that required concentration. The progression from wakefulness to sleep was more direct and less drawn out, with people going to bed earlier and sleeping more deeply, their bodies needing rest and repair after the labor of the day. The seasonal changes brought variations to these evening routines, though the basic structure remained the same. In summer, when daylight lasted longer, the evening activities might begin later and might sometimes be conducted outdoors, on a porch or in a yard, where it was cooler than inside the house. People might sit on wooden benches or chairs brought outside, doing their handwork or their whittling or their reading in the fading natural light, listening to the sounds of crickets and frogs, feeling the slight movement of air that passed for a breeze on a hot evening. The transition to bed would come when the mosquitoes became too bothersome, or when the light failed completely and it became impossible to see well enough to continue with whatever task was at hand. In winter, the evenings began earlier, as darkness came on in the late afternoon, and the activities were more concentrated around sources of heat. The fire became even more central to the evening, and people arranged themselves as close to it as was comfortable, sometimes pulling their chairs into a tight semicircle around the hearth. The cold outside made the warmth and light inside feel even more precious and worth protecting, and there was less coming and going, less opening of doors that would let in drafts of icy air. The winter evenings felt longer and more enclosed, but also more intimate and cozy, with the small circle of warmth and light feeling like a safe haven from the cold, dark world beyond the walls. Throughout the year, certain special evenings would bring variations to the routine. When there were visitors, neighbors, or family members from elsewhere, the evening might involve more conversation and perhaps some special refreshments, tea or coffee or cider, and perhaps some simple food, cookies or cake or bread with preserves. The talk would range more widely than usual, catching up on news and events, sharing stories and observations. But even these social evenings maintained a basic quietness and slowness, with conversation moving at a measured pace and with comfortable pauses between topics. Sometimes there would be informal music, if someone in the household or among the visitors played an instrument. There might be a fiddle or a guitar or a harmonica or a piano, if the family was prosperous enough to own one. The music would be simple, folk songs and hymns and popular tunes that everyone knew, played without elaborate technique or performance, just played for the pleasure of making sound and hearing it, for the way it brought people together and gave them something to share. People might sing along, their voices blending in rough harmonies, or they might simply listen, tapping a foot or nodding in time with the rhythm, letting the music fill the room and add another layer to the peaceful atmosphere. Other evenings might include simple games, particularly in households with older children. There might be card games played on the dining table or the kitchen table, the cards dealt and played by lamplight, each trick won or lost with mild satisfaction or disappointment but no real excitement or intensity. Or there might be board games, checkers or chess, or simpler games involving dice or counters, played with attention but without competition that was too fierce or serious. The games were another way to pass the time together, another structure for the evening that involved everyone and gave hands and minds something to do while the hours moved toward bedtime. In some communities, particularly in towns and villages, there might be occasional evening gatherings at a neighbor's house or at a community building, a grange hall or a church basement or a schoolhouse. These gatherings served as social occasions and as entertainment, a break from the routine of individual household evenings. There might be a speaker giving a lecture on some topic of general interest, travel or history or agriculture or moral improvement. There might be a dramatic reading or a recitation of poetry. There might be a social gathering with refreshments and conversation and perhaps some singing or dancing, though all conducted in ways that were considered appropriate and moderate and respectable. Even these community evenings, which represented the more social and public side of life before radio and television, moved at the same measured pace as private evenings at home. There was no recorded entertainment to provide a constant stream of novelty and stimulation. No professional performers arriving from distant cities to dazzle local audiences. Instead, the entertainment came from within the community itself, from people using whatever talents and abilities they possessed to provide diversion and interest for their neighbors. The quality might be uneven and the offerings might be simple, but there was a participatory quality to these gatherings that would be lost when entertainment became something created by professionals and consumed by audiences through electronic media. Back at home, as the evening finally drew to a close and people settled into their beds, the darkness would be complete and the silence would be deep, broken only by those small, familiar sounds of the house and the night. There were no glowing screens to be checked one last time, no late-night programs to tempt people to stay awake just a little longer, no sense that something was happening somewhere else that was being missed. The day was over. The evening had been spent in simple and repetitive ways, and now it was time for sleep, time to let consciousness fade and to rest until morning brought light and activity again. The experience of these evenings before radio and television became common was marked by a kind of slowness and simplicity that would become increasingly rare as technology advanced and as the pace of life accelerated. The evening hours were not empty or wasted, but were filled with small, meaningful activities that connected people to each other and to the materials and objects of their daily lives. There was a directness and immediacy to these activities, a sense of being present in the moment rather than being transported elsewhere by electronic means, a groundedness in physical reality that came from working with hands and materials, from sitting in a particular room with particular people, from being limited by the reach of lamplight and by the natural human need for rest. These evenings created a rhythm to daily life that was reliable and predictable, a sense of structure and routine that many people found comforting and sustaining. The lack of external stimulation meant that people were more dependent on their own resources and on each other for interest and occupation. more inclined to develop skills and hobbies that could be pursued at home, more likely to value conversation and companionship as forms of entertainment in themselves. The simplicity of these evenings also meant that expectations were different, that people did not feel entitled to constant novelty and excitement, that they could be content with less and find satisfaction in repetition and in the small pleasures of daily routine. As the night deepened and as sleep came closer, the memories of the evening would begin to blur and soften, the details becoming less distinct, the sequence of small events fading into an overall impression of time that had been spent peacefully and without stress or drama. Tomorrow evening would be much the same, and the evening after that, and the evening after that, each one a gentle echo of all the evenings that had come before, each one contributing to a sense of continuity and stability that ran through life like a quiet thread, barely noticed but always there, holding things together in ways that were only recognized when they were gone. And so the evenings passed, one after another, quiet and slow and filled with simple things, the lamp burning steadily, the fire crackling softly, hands moving through familiar motions, voices murmuring in low tones, time flowing forward at its own pace, unhurried and calm, leading gently and inevitably toward sleep and rest and the darkness that welcomed everyone equally at the end of each day.